It was the 1980s, and my uncle was living in the old family house, deep in the countryside. The house itself had always carried a strange aura, its wooden beams groaning with age, and its darkened hallways whispering forgotten secrets. It was a relic from another era, handed down through generations of our family. Everyone in the village knew about the old house. They spoke in hushed tones, trading rumors of strange occurrences. Doors that would unlock themselves, shadows moving where there should be none, and the strange, unsettling feeling of always being watched. My uncle never believed in those tales, until that one night when everything changed. It had been a long day of work, and by the time my uncle returned from the fields, the village was already blanketed in darkness. The only sound was the distant call of an owl and the occasional rustling of leaves in the cool evening breeze. He locked the door behind him and went to bed, exhausted. The house, as it often was deathly quiet. My grandfather, his father, was fast asleep in the next room. My uncle lay on the couch in the hall, staring out the window at the lantern that cast a pale, yellow light into the room. The hatch above the window was open, and the soft glow illuminated the old, creaky furniture in an eerie way. Though exhausted, sleep didn't come. My uncle found himself lying awake, staring out of the window, his mind wandering. He couldn't shake the unsettling stillness that filled the house that night. It was in this state of restless wakefulness that something caught his eye, a white blur that flew past the window, barely noticeable in the light of the lantern outside. His heart quickened, but he told himself it was probably just fog or his tired mind playing tricks on him. He tried to settle back down, but the white shape appeared again, drifting just outside the window. This time it lingered, floating slowly, almost deliberately. The pale light of the street lamp illuminated it faintly, and my uncle could now see that this was no fog. It was the form of a woman. She seemed to glide through the air, her movements slow and ethereal. Panic surged through him, but he was frozen in place, unable to tear his gaze away from the window. Then, without warning, she began to move toward the house. Before my uncle could react, the figure passed right through the window, dissolving the boundary between the outside world and the house. She floated silently through the air, an unsettling calm surrounding her as though time itself had stopped. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, void of life, were locked onto my uncle's. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His body was paralyzed with fear as the woman slowly drifted toward him. She was no longer just a blur. Her figure was solidifying, becoming clearer with each passing second. He could see the long, flowing white dress she wore, her dark hair floating unnaturally around her head. As she hovered above him, a single, icy breath filled the room. It chilled him to his core. The moment the ghostly woman reached out her hand, something broke inside him, and the scream he had been holding in finally tore free. The sound echoed through the house, piercing the suffocating silence that had gripped it moments before. In an instant, the white woman recoiled, her form becoming smoke-like again as she retreated. She flew out of the room, passing through the hallway door without making a sound. But even as she disappeared, my uncle's terror only grew. The door that he had locked himself just hours before, swung open slowly, its creaking hinges filling the air with an ominous sound. The scream woke my grandfather in the next room. He rushed to my uncle's side, his heart racing as he heard the sound of the hallway door creaking open. When he entered the hall, he found my uncle standing frozen, pale as a sheet, staring at the open door. "What happened?" my grandfather asked, though his own heart told him something unnatural had occurred. My uncle turned slowly to face him, still trembling. "Did you see her?" he whispered. Grandfather looked toward the door, and his eyes widened in shock. He had seen something, too. Just a brief glimpse, but enough to confirm his worst fear. A faint, white mist was floating through the door and into the night, dissipating as it went. As the terror subsided, they both stared at the front door. The locks, they had been opened, every single one. My uncle had locked the door before bed, ensuring no one could enter, and yet here it was wide open, as if the spirit had simply walked through it like any living person. They checked the locks multiple times, but each one slid back into place easily. There was no sign of forced entry, no rational explanation for how it had opened. Both men exchanged silent glances, knowing full well that what they had experienced was not of this world. The next day, the village was buzzing with quiet gossip. Word of my uncle's encounter spread quickly, and whispers of the white woman began to circulate. Some villagers believed it was the spirit of a woman who had died tragically in the area long ago. Others thought it was an omen, a warning. My uncle tried to forget the experience, to convince himself it had been a bad dream or a figment of his imagination. But the way the village spoke of the old house, how no one wanted to get too close to it, made him realize that his encounter was just one of many strange things to happen in that place. Curious and still shaken by the encounter, my uncle decided to dig into the history of the house. What he discovered was unsettling. Decades ago, a woman had indeed died near the house under mysterious circumstances. Some said she had been jilted by a lover, left heartbroken and desperate. Others whispered that she had been accused of witchcraft and had taken her own life in shame. Her body had never been found, but sightings of a white woman had been reported in the village for generations. Each time she appeared, strange things followed: sickness, misfortune, or even death. For months after that night, my uncle lived in fear that the white woman would return. He began to dread the evenings, when the light from the street lamp would cast shadows in his room and the house would fall silent. One night, just when he thought he could finally move on, the white woman reappeared. She came in the same way as before, through the window, her movements slow and deliberate. But this time, something was different. She seemed stronger, more vivid, as though she was gaining power. Her gaze was no longer passive, it was angry. This time, she didn't retreat at his scream. She moved toward him with a cold fury, her pale hand reaching for his throat. In his panic, my uncle scrambled out of bed and ran to find my grandfather. Together, they barricaded themselves in the living room, unsure of what to do. That night, they stayed awake, hearing strange noises coming from all over the house. Footsteps, whispers, the faint sound of weeping. Desperate for answers, they searched the house the next day, looking for anything that might explain the haunting. In the attic, hidden behind old furniture, they discovered a small door they had never noticed before. It led to a tiny, secret room filled with dust and decay. Inside the room was a single object, an old, weathered locket. Inside the locket was a small photograph of a woman. Young, beautiful, and unmistakably the same woman who had appeared as the white spirit. Alongside the photo was a note, faded with time, but still legible. It told the tragic story of the woman who had been betrayed by her lover and left to die alone. The locket, my uncle soon realized, was not just a memento. It was a curse. It had been buried in the house for decades, binding the woman's spirit to the place, trapping her in her misery. Now that they had disturbed the locket, the haunting grew worse. Every night, the woman appeared, no longer just floating, but moving with purpose. Objects began to fly across the room. Lights flickered on and off, and doors would slam, shut of their own accord. My uncle was on the verge of a breakdown. He knew they couldn't stay in the house much longer. Something had to be done to break the curse. Desperate, my uncle and grandfather sought the help of the village elder, who was rumored to know how to deal with the supernatural. The elder listened to their story and instructed them on how to perform a ritual to release the woman's spirit. On the night of the full moon, they followed the elder's instructions, placing the locket in the center of the house and lighting candles around it. As they chanted the words the elder had given them, the house shook violently, and the white woman appeared for the final time. But this time, something was different. As they chanted, the white woman's expression softened. The anger faded from her face, replaced by sorrow. Slowly, her figure began to fade, and with a final, Heartbreaking look. She disappeared. The locket crumbled to dust, and the house fell silent once more. From that day forward, the white woman was never seen again. The house remained quiet, the locks stayed closed, and my uncle was finally free from the terror that had haunted him. But even though the spirit had moved on, the memory of her presence lingered, a chilling reminder of the darkness that had once gripped our family home. Years had passed since the haunting of the white woman in the family home. The old house had stood quietly, undisturbed, its past buried under layers of time and dust. My uncle had long since moved away, and the eerie tales surrounding the house faded into mere folklore among the villagers. Eventually, it seemed like the spirits had left for good, but life has a way of bringing the past back to you, whether you're ready for it or not. After a difficult divorce and the stresses of raising 2 children on my own, I found myself in need of a fresh start. The family home, vacant for years, seemed like the perfect place to begin again. It wasn't ideal. The house was old, creaky, and filled with memories that made my skin crawl. But I had always thought of it as just that, a house. The stories were distant whispers of another time. Besides, it had been peaceful for so long. I moved in with my 2 children, Emma and Ben, hoping to create a new chapter for us, far away from the chaos of the life I was leaving behind. At first, everything seemed normal. The children loved the wide open space, the creaky wooden floors, and the massive backyard where they could play freely. We spent the first few days unpacking, cleaning, and settling into our new routine. But then, small things started to happen, things that made me uneasy. At night, as I lay in bed, I would hear faint whispers coming from the hallway. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, but when I checked, no one was there. The air inside the house felt heavier as the days went on, as though the walls were absorbing something dark and unspoken. One night, Emma came to me, clutching her blanket and whispering in the dark. "Mom, I saw a lady," she said, her voice trembling. She was floating in my room. My heart stopped for a moment, but I forced a smile. "It was just a dream, sweetheart," I told her, trying to keep my voice calm. But deep down, I couldn't shake the fear that something had returned. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent and more intense. Lights flickered without explanation. Doors that I had locked would swing open on their own, and I began waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone pacing back and forth downstairs. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, Ben looked up suddenly, his face pale. "Who's the lady standing in the corner, Mom?" he asked. I froze, turning to look where he was pointing, but the corner was empty. Still, the fear in his voice was real, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know how to respond. My children were seeing her, the same woman my uncle had seen all those years ago. The white woman had returned. The haunting escalated quickly. One night, as I was reading in bed, I heard a loud crash from Emma's room. Rushing in, I found her sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and terrified. Her closet door had been flung open, and her toys were scattered across the floor as though someone had thrown them. "She was here again," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "The white lady," she said, "she's looking for something." A chill ran down my spine. The spirit wasn't just appearing. She was searching for something. But what? And why had she returned now? I needed answers, and fast. Determined to protect my children, I decided to visit my uncle, hoping that he could shed some light on what was happening. We hadn't spoken much about his experience, and I realized that there were probably details he had never shared. When I arrived at his house, he greeted me with a look of concern, as though he already knew why I had come. "I should have told you more," he said quietly after I explained what had been happening. "But I thought it was over. I thought she had finally moved on." He then revealed something he had never shared with anyone before. When he and my grandfather had discovered the locket all those years ago, they had assumed the ritual had freed the spirit. But what they hadn't realized was that the locket wasn't the only thing binding her to the house. There was something else,